everybody, and thank you for joining us for this artist talk as part of our series of artist talks. Today, we are going to be speaking to Erin Haldane, who is part of our exhibit entitled Over, Under, and Through, an exhibition of works by three very different artists. And we're happy to have Erin here today. My name is Deborah Rosinski. I'm the executive director of BAC, Bainbridge Arts and Crafts, and we are pleased to show Erin's work. She has been a roster artist with us for a number of years. She's a mixed media artist working primarily in oil painting, nature mort, French for still life. She works in oils on wood typically, but also does some work with watercolor illustration and block printing. She's interested in the natural world and expressing kind of the magic of everyday life. And I'm particularly drawn to your still life works and the collection of objects that you show in them and the kind of the reality of them, the dimensionality of them, combined with this sort of flat feel with the wood behind them. And I also find a kind of quiet humor in them and the book titles that you pick. And I was looking in particular at one piece, you have several self-portraits that show stacks of books and titles and a few objects interspersed. And your self-portrait number 2, I enjoyed the collection of titles there. In particular, A Perfectly Kept House is the sign of a misspent life. And it just cracked me up. I also want to mention a little more about your background. You grew up, you're native to Alaska, part of the Tsimshian tribe, and spent most of your childhood in Anchorage, then went to school in Santa Fe University of Art, and started grad school at Portland State, and then the pandemic made that difficult to continue. I'll step back and let you start talking a bit about that background, and in particular, I'm curious what attracted you to this kind of still life subject matter and approach.
Yeah, I had been working in portraiture for a long time, and I kind of, the thing I liked about it was like having a subject to study, and I kind of liked bringing humor into it. And so when I started working with still life, I liked that I had a little bit more control over the narrative, rather than because I was doing portraits kind of people in makeup and in costume, and I kind of liked that that ambiguous nature of where they were coming from or where they were going, and it kind of creating a story just in the one picture. And so the more I started playing with still life, I realized that I really liked playing with scale. And one of the things that I like about that medium, and something I did ever since I was a kid, was kind of picture myself small. And so I like the idea of like looking at the world through the eyes of if you were a really tiny person. And I think that that's also where some of the humor comes in as well, of playing with scale, looking around. I also, the book, A Perfectly Kept House is the Sign of a Misspent Life has been the one that's been on my shelf for a long time. And because I'm, as someone who's a still life artist and also just someone who enjoys collecting things, I end up with a lot of areas. Even behind me, this is my studio. I like to collect similar objects or find goofy little objects. Or I've also like gotten objects from my grandma. This is a little picture. This is actually in one of my still lifes as well.
Yeah, I recognize that one.
Yeah.
And figures have a kind of monumentality to them, and the books lend some scale, but at the same time, you can imagine them at any scale. So it's interesting. You picture yourself as,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I like the idea of this being like a giant a giant thing to look at, and being able to look at it really close. And I think that that's something I also really like about painting is the process, the slow process of really looking deeply at something and taking the time to look at every aspect of it.
Yeah, that really comes through. I'm really struck by how these are, immobile objects, but it's like they have a rich inner life that comes through. Just each one, I feel their personality come through in the way that you render them.
Yeah, and I feel like books do that in a lot of ways too, where like you were saying how you know there were already a couple of books that you recognized, and how often when we go to someone's house or we meet them, things like the things that they've read, or the objects that they have around their house, that these are things that we can either relate to in ourselves or use to learn more about them, and even like the binding of a book beginning to crease, you can tell how much someone has read it and reread it, or how long they've had it, and for some things it's like books are fun because it's like a little compact memory bank of a story you've been through, or for art books, art that you've like looked at and brings like comfort or humor to your life.
I'm really drawn to the kind of mix of elements, some from your cultural background, some from your life as an artist, rubber cement or different tools or objects from an antique shop. So it seems to represent a lot of things you're drawn to and interested in.
Yeah. And for still life number two, that one in particular has been kind of like my education in art, and how those different artists have shaped my life. And when I was younger and in high school, I was a lot more into like collage, so like the Rubber Cement and the Ray Johnson books. That he was like one of the first people that got me really interested in art. And so when I see those books, and when I see even just my little can of dried out rubber cement, it always brings me back.
And that always happens, and the little dress gets stuck, and yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
it's so disappointing.
Yeah.
I see some interest in origami, and some pieces look like they're folded paper. Do you?
Yeah, that's something that my dad taught me, and he's always been really good with his hands. He's done some wood carving as well as cross stitch, and he also builds like scale model airplanes and cars, and so he really likes working with his hands in a really precise way. And that's something that I definitely feel like I inherited from him. And origami is something that he taught me, and I also really enjoy as another kind of one of those meditative practices where, especially with the unit origami, where you're just making piece after piece that you can then build an object with. And I like the impermanence of origami too, since it's paper, and traditionally you don't use glue, so it can like fall apart over time, which I kind of like that.
I notice in your CV, you spent some time working at the Georgia O'Keeffe home in Santa Fe area. What was that like?
That was great, and that actually was my first kind of introduction into working really closely with still life. I was part of I was the first of this internship program where we documented Georgia O'Keeffe's objects from her house. The Georgia O'Keeffe Museum inherited her estate, and so they have like all of her old camping equipment, her clothes, her shoes, and the idea between Linda Swanson and the curator at the time, Carolyn Kastner, came up with this idea of documenting these objects rather than through photography, through these students looking at the objects. So I got to go into their archives and pick different things to draw and to study. And it was a really really cool experience. The first still life I did there was a tube of her old paints that had been like mostly squeezed out. And it was so neat to see. I drew a couple of her shoes and like a camping lantern. And it was a really fun way to to kind of like feel like I was connecting with the artist herself rather than just through her work.
What an amazing opportunity. That's so,
it was so cool. Yeah, I loved it.
I mean, the resonance of those objects and what they meant and what they mean. And that's a great kind of connection to what you're doing now. To see that source is really interesting.
Yeah, and I love and that goes again to this still lives I do now, and and things like that little picture and stuff, how much history an object can hold, and especially something like paint tubes, or a book, something that gets used a lot that you can see the use. I really like having like almost physical evidence of the history, which I think is really neat.
Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated too how different people, based on their different backgrounds, see different aspects of an object. Like, I had this great teacher. He has an industrial design background, and he did this exercise with a class one day where he just put all these objects on a table, and he had a whole group of us walk around and then pick up something and talk about it. And I was a glass student at the time, and a fellow glass student saw an object. It was an Alvar Aalto glass vase, which to him meant cheap production work because he saw the process of making it. And to me, I associated it with the Museum of Modern Art in New York and this high object, revered with this big name designer. And it's where we grew up and what we were exposed to, and it changed how we interpreted what we saw. And I just thought that was a really kind of amazing lesson.
Yeah, definitely.
And just that surprise in hearing what people get when they look at one's work as compared to what you intend when you're making the work. That always fascinates me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had a studio visit with an artist, and she was interested in that the I Spy piece, and for me it was like all of my like childhood objects, things that that currently inspire my work, like the I Spy books. That's like these kind of cluttered cluttered images that you then like seek out the treasures in, and so for me it had like my intention behind it was one to be really whimsical, and for her her knowing that I was like Native, she saw these as very like colonialized objects that had a lot more of like a darker feel than I had ever intended. So it's interesting. It's always interesting people's like first response to it, and she got something else out of it, and I'm happy for that. I think that that's actually one of the gifts of being an artist, that you can create something and it can speak to someone in a way that you didn't even intend, and that creating a new conversation and something else to consider, even in your own intentions. If you don't intend something, it's kind of fun to see what'll come out.
Yeah, the layers of communication are kind of what it's all about, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and we're excited to have your work here. And we look forward to further conversations like this, and watching your career as it moves along over time.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm super excited to see how this show comes together and how it does. And yeah, I'm excited for the future moving forward.
Be sure not to miss Over, Under, and Through: 3 artists, 3 perspectives, featuring artists Erin Haldane, Susan E. Walker, and Judith Zugish at Bainbridge Arts and Crafts from July 2nd through August 1st.